3 days after the bomb fell on Hiroshima, rice balls started arriving from villages most people in the city had never had a reason to visit, thrown from truck beds to survivors too weak to catch them. That's the part that almost sounds hopeful. But 42 of the city's 45 hospitals were gone, and 9 out of 10 doctors and nurses in Hiroshima were dead or hurt too badly to work. For the next 30 days, tens of thousands of survivors had to keep themselves alive with no medicine, no antiseptic, and almost no one left standing who knew how to help them. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya ran the communications hospital, about a mile from where the bomb went off. The blast stripped every stitch of clothing from his body before he even understood what had happened. And by the time he crawled to what was left of his hospital, flying glass and wood had cut him something like 150 times. His wife, Yaiko, was burned badly enough that for days nobody was sure she would live.
And here's the detail that tells you everything about that first morning. The hospital was still standing, mostly because its walls were concrete. Everything inside it, the beds, the drugs, the trained hands to use them, was gone or dying. Outside, what had been a city of over 300,000 people looked in places like it had simply been erased, down to its foundations. Hachiya kept a diary through the whole ordeal, 56 days of it, and reading it back now feels less like history and more like someone narrating their own emergency in real time. The question that month keeps forcing on you isn't whether the city would ever look normal again. It's whether the people still breathing inside it could last long enough to find out. For the people who made it to a hospital at all, there wasn't much a hospital could actually do for them. Picture the ward the way survivors describe it. Patients laid out on bare floors because every bed was already taken, some of them spilling into the hallways and even into the bathrooms, groaning quietly enough that the sound blurred into background noise within a day. So the wounds just sat there. Burns that should have been cleaned and dressed within hours went untouched for days, and in the August heat, they started to rot. Survivors who lived through it describe wounds filling with pus, and within about a week, crawling with maggots. A naval medical orderly working one of the first aid stations later said the flies became a kind of second enemy after dark, when mosquitoes moved in on burned skin that had nothing left to defend it. Nobody sprayed anything to stop it until American aircraft finally dropped DDT over the city on August 29th, more than 3 weeks after the bombing, which meant 3 full weeks of open wounds fighting off insects with nothing but bare cloth and whatever strength the patient had left. Until then, patients did what they could with old newspaper laid over bare skin, which is a strange thing to picture as medical care, but that August it was. Food, strangely, was the one place the city almost got lucky. The morning after the bombing, someone inside the wrecked city government remembered an old air raid contingency plan and phoned surrounding towns asking them to make rice balls and truck them in. It actually worked. For about 10 days, relief convoys kept rolling into Hiroshima, and for survivors camped along the roads, a rice ball tossed from a truck bed was sometimes the difference between getting up the next morning or not. Some people were too far gone to even eat what landed in their hands. They just held on to it, like the shape of the food itself was proof that someone out there still remembered they existed. City officials later admitted the rice ball plan was practically the only piece of their pre-war disaster preparation that actually worked as designed, which says something about how little any city on Earth had actually rehearsed for a morning like this one. Water was the harder problem. The city's pipes were shattered, and the fires had left people so thirsty that when a strange, oily, black rain started falling, roughly half an hour after the blast, a lot of survivors turned their faces up and drank it straight from the sky. Nobody knew yet that the rain was carrying fallout back down with it. They just knew they were dying of thirst, and something wet was finally falling. Sleep barely existed as its own category that month. There were almost no beds left standing in the city, so survivors slept wherever they stopped moving.
Scorched pavement, bamboo groves outside the city limits, the floor of any schoolhouse that still had a roof. One young diarist who spent that first night outdoors remembered the ground being too hard to lie on comfortably and the air turning cold once the sun went down. A small, almost embarrassing complaint next to everything else happening around her. And yet it's the detail that stuck. Those schools became the closest thing Hiroshima had to hospitals. One of them, the first elementary school, stayed standing and turned into a relief station that ran until October, with part of its own schoolyard doubling as a crematorium. That's not a detail thrown in for shock value. It's the actual arrangement survivors lived inside for weeks, the people trying to recover, and the people being burned for the last time, sharing the same patch of ground, sometimes close enough to hear each other. By the 10th day, the bodies of those killed outright had mostly been gathered, mainly by military work crews sent in from outside the city. But there wasn't enough fuel left anywhere nearby to cremate them properly. Soldiers started laying sheets of zinc roofing over the half-burned dead and leaving them to finish on their own heat, because there was nothing else to do with them. This wasn't a shortage of hospital beds anymore. It was a city trying to bury more people than it had buried in the last several years combined, in a matter of days, with no equipment and no one left to spare. Survivors walking past that open ground remembered the smoke from those makeshift pyres more than almost anything else from that stretch of the month, because it never really stopped drifting over the relief stations where the living were still trying to recover. Cleanliness, if you could call it that, mostly stopped existing.
Soap was gone, along with everything else, and with the water supply wrecked, nobody was properly washing burns, hands, or the rice bowls being passed hand to hand between strangers. The smell alone was enough to mark a relief station from 100 meters away. Smoke that never fully cleared, wounds turning sour in the heat, and under all of it, the flat mineral smell of a city that had been scraped down to brick and ash. Dysentery and other gut infections spread easily through relief stations packed shoulder to shoulder, adding a second wave of sick people to a system that had already run out of ways to help the first wave. And underneath the physical misery sat a quieter, harder problem: fear of the survivors themselves. Word spread that something about this bomb was different, that people who looked fine could just start dying days later for no visible reason. And that uncertainty made some people afraid to get close to the wounded at all, even family. Parents searched relief stations for days, calling out names into rooms full of faces too swollen or burned to recognize. Children who'd lost their parents in the blast were often left to be claimed by whoever recognized them among the crowds, because there was no functioning system left to reunite anyone properly, and some never were. And then, about a week or two in, something started happening that no doctor left standing in Hiroshima had a name for. People who'd walked away from the blast with barely a scratch began losing their hair in handfuls. Their gums bled without being touched. Purple spots spread under their skin like bruises nobody remembered getting. Dr. Hachiya watched it happen to patients he'd cleared as fine days earlier and had no real idea what he was looking at, because nobody on Earth had treated this particular sickness before that August. He and the handful of doctors still on their feet worked from guesswork, trying whatever they had against something that had never existed until 3 weeks earlier. Some patients who'd seemed to be recovering were dead within days, and the doctors who'd sent them home as fine just days earlier had no framework left to trust their own judgment. That was the cruelest part of that first month. The bomb didn't finish killing people on August 6th. It kept collecting new victims for weeks after the fires went out, and the people trying to save them couldn't even tell you what was doing the killing. Word about what had actually happened traveled slower than the sickness did. Radio and newspapers inside Japan gave almost nothing real away for days, so most of what people in Hiroshima understood about their own catastrophe came from rumor passed hospital bed to hospital bed. Some guessed it was a new kind of incendiary.
Others swore the Americans had somehow set the air itself on fire. Hachiya wrote about lying in his hospital bed, trying to piece together a single new type of bomb from a dozen contradictory stories, all of them told by people just as burned and just as confused as he was. It took the better part of that first month for anything close to an accurate picture to reach the people who had actually lived through it, which meant survivors were nursing wounds from a weapon nobody around them could name. Help did eventually arrive, just not on any schedule anyone inside the city controlled. Japanese Army and Navy medical teams were redirected in from other regions once word of the scale finally got out. And by early September, additional doctors, nurses and supplies were reaching Hiroshima faster than the first 10 days had allowed. Temporary hospitals opened in nearby towns for patients well enough to be moved.
It was still nowhere near enough for what the city needed, and the survivors who'd made it through the worst of that first month on rice balls, rainwater, and whatever a barely standing hospital could scrape together were by then the ones who'd already proven they could survive without it. Hachiya himself didn't get anything resembling a real diagnosis for his own condition until weeks after the blast, and he was the director of a hospital. For an ordinary resident with no medical training and no connections, real answers were even further away, and some never came at all. By most estimates, Hiroshima lost something like 140,000 people by the end of that year, though nobody was ever able to count with real precision, since so many bodies were never identified and so many records burned along with the buildings that held them. What actually got the survivors through that first month wasn't medicine, because there basically wasn't any left to give. It was villages sending rice they could barely spare. It was nurses who kept working with hands they could hardly close. It was neighbors who pulled strangers out of collapsed houses and never learned their names before moving to the next pile of debris. None of it fixed anything, and none of it undid what the bomb had already done. It just bought people enough time to still be alive when real help finally started arriving, weeks later than anyone wounded that morning could have afforded to wait. So here's the question worth sitting with for a second. Every one of those villages that sent rice, every nurse who didn't stop, every stranger who dug with their bare hands, showed up before any government agency managed to. If the hospitals in your city vanished tomorrow, and the only thing standing between you and the aftermath was whoever happened to still be walking nearby, no ambulance, no antibiotics, no one with the training to actually help, would there be enough of them, and would you be one of them? There's another month like this one buried in almost every disaster you've ever half heard of, quieter than the headline event, but every bit as brutal to actually live through. I'm already digging through the next one.